Welcome back. This is World Talks coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Jastrzębska. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has arrived in Armenia to take part in the European Political Community Summit. Zelenskyy is expected to meet with the prime ministers of Norway, Finland, the United Kingdom and the Czech Republic. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has announced plans to withdraw 5,000 American soldiers from Germany, saying this is just the beginning of further, as yet unspecified, cuts. To discuss these latest developments, I'm joined by Aleksander Cwalina, contractor, Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Good evening, sir. Delighted to have you with us.
Hello, good evening. Glad to join.
So let's start with the EPC summit. President Zelenskyy is set to meet Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. Now, Babiš took office in December, and during the campaign, he repeatedly pledged to scrap the Czech-led ammunition initiative for Ukraine, arguing that taxpayer money should be spent at home. However, since taking office, he softened that stance, saying the initiative can continue if it's fully funded by international partners. So where does Babiš stand on Ukraine right now?
It seems that probably the early sort of posturing was a pre-election sort of following this populist wave, as we saw under Hungary as well. But now that with Fidesz losing in the recent elections and Péter Magyar seeming to be the next prime minister of Hungary, it seems like this sort of populist wave against further European support for Ukraine is waning. And it seems like this sort of reconciliation, the very fact that there is a dialogue, as we're seeing with Babiš and with Zelenskyy, this is a good step forward for continued European cooperation and hopefully a swelling, or not swelling, but a lessening of this sort of populist wave that saw Ukrainian support for Ukraine on the European side come into question.
Now, last night Zelenskyy held a phone call with another European leader who used to oppose Ukraine's EU membership, but has changed his mind. I'm talking, of course, about Robert Fico of Slovakia. So Fico, who is also set to attend Victory Day parade in Moscow on May 9th. So how do you read this?
I see this primarily as the sort of move for someone on the European side to set themselves up as a negotiator between both Europe and Russia in terms of future peace for Ukraine. However, I at least believe that this sort of positioning is naive in the sense that you are, as we saw with the Trump Anchorage summit, President Trump of the United States tried doing a similar tactic where he invited Vladimir Putin to discuss a possible ceasefire in Ukraine, and this was later used by Moscow to show to the world that, hey, we are not so isolated, we are open to dialogue, and that this has resulted in only positives for Moscow and not much in the ways of dialogue, as we've seen since the Anchorage summit, that Moscow touts as being very productive and keeps bringing up, but the Trump administration seems to be running into continuous difficulties in managing a sort of peace from that dialogue.
You've already mentioned Péter Magyar, and he is set to take office in Hungary in several days. He says he will approve talks on Ukraine joining the EU only if Kyiv grants greater rights to Hungarian minority. That's according to a Bloomberg report. So what do you think of such a transactional approach, if you will?
It's difficult to tell currently, since he is not yet prime minister, where it is sort of, I can see this as being still sort of this positioning left over from the campaign, where he has to appeal to these sorts of to this sort of nationalist and Hungarian-driven rhetoric. But as we've seen with a lot of these figures that come into power and then actually have to join the European Council meetings, that have to negotiate with other heads of state and government, I see this as possibly being not particularly watered down, but negotiated with other heads of state and government to a level that it might not be this sort of blocking. I assume, since he primarily campaigned against this on this sort of break with from Orban's government and pledged to work more closely with Brussels and with the European Union, I see it as unlikely that this will become a particular sticking point, but it might come up in discussions between, for example, Magyar and Ursula von der Leyen in negotiating for the frozen funds for Hungary.
Now, let's zoom in on the latest U.S. actions towards Ukraine and Europe, because on one hand, we have the much-awaited $400 million in support for Ukraine. On the other, Donald Trump is withdrawing troops from Germany, 5,000 for now, but he said there could be more. How is this transatlantic spat on the EU-US front, especially with Germany, impacting Ukraine?
That's an excellent question. I've been following the Germany troop withdrawal closely, with some people saying that it is exaggeration, since 30,000 troops will still remain in Germany. U.S. troops will still remain in Germany. However, the symbolic significance of this cannot be understated, and it has a direct impact on Ukraine as well. Primarily, it weakens the security guarantee architecture, for example, any sort of boots on the ground to maintain a ceasefire in Ukraine. A U.S. with a shrinking European footprint offers generally thinner deterrence. It also accelerates European strategic autonomy, but on a timeline that outpaces European capacity, in the sense that a lot of European militaries and a lot of European security ministries of defense are still building up this sort of capabilities to step in on where the United States is currently providing capabilities. And significantly as well, Trump is explicitly using this sort of posture and U.S. troops in Europe as a political instrument to discipline European allies and to not only supporting his negotiating line on Russia and Ukraine, but also over their statements on the war in Iran, as well as we've seen in the case from Merz, but also with similar threats levied against Italy as well.
Now, on Wednesday of last week, Donald Trump held a 90-minute phone call with Vladimir Putin, describing it as very good. I mean, Trump suggested even that Putin might announce a short ceasefire in Ukraine. How credible is this?
I believe this ceasefire refers directly to the Victory Day parade ceasefire that Putin proposed on May 9th. This is primarily just a sort of gift cover to give Putin a nice parade on a very important day for both him and for maintaining and presenting a unified Kremlin signal. However, this is just another way of leading the negotiations along for Moscow, in the sense that it is not to build towards any sort of durable ceasefire or to any sort of cessation of the conflict, but rather, as I said previously, just to offer a nice image on Russian state media of continued Russian strength and capabilities, which is already going to be a bit dulled by the fact that there will be no military equipment shown at this military day parade, first in the parade's history since the end of World War II, which is itself notable.
Now, nearly three-quarters of Ukrainians said last month that they do not believe that the current U.S.-mediated negotiations will lead to lasting peace. That's according to the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. So in your view, can these negotiations still work out?
I would like to believe in the power of diplomacy, but I honestly have to say that structurally very little has been moved since the February Geneva talks in Geneva. The pattern of sort of these sporadic low commitment gestures between Washington and Moscow haven't really engaged the core sticking points, in the sense that Moscow continues to want full annexation of the territories they currently occupy, and they want to veto on any sort of Western military presence in Ukraine, as well as on a severe demobilization of Ukrainian military forces, presumably so they can come back later, so they can regain forces and come back at a later point in time. Ukraine has shown the flexibility to according to Washington's points, and has shown the flexibility to build towards, and repeatedly calls for a lasting ceasefire to hold significant peace talks on a post-war architecture. But this is not being reflected in Moscow, who continues to sort of reiterate the points of annexing the territory, not only where the current line of conflict is, but also beyond to the territories they claim to annex.
Ukraine has been striking Russia on all sides, with Zelenskyy saying that Moscow's losses now total about $7 billion this year. Zelenskyy is also boosting military pay in this military reform, but will it be enough? And how serious manpower shortage is there in Ukraine, both in Ukraine and in Russia?
The manpower shortage is definitely a significant concern. We've seen this in Russia, is that they're dipping into there's talks of renewed conscription drives. They're dipping into prison populations as a source of reboosting manpower, and the fact that Russian casualties far outnumber Ukrainian casualties on the front line too signifies that this has turned into a war of attrition on the Russian side as well. But that is not to say that Ukraine similarly does not experience issues and concerns with manpower. I think the current stance by Zelenskyy to continue to boost manpower on the Ukrainian side is primarily depends on the continued support that his and Ukraine's European partners continue to provide to Ukraine, both financially and in terms of military support, which unfortunately the signals, at least from Washington, have been ambivalent, which means that European heads of state of government, as well as their respective foreign and defense ministries, need to step up and kind of fill in this sort of void left by the United States.
Aleksander Cwalina, thank you so very much for joining us this evening and for sharing your expertise. Much appreciated.
Excellent. Thank you.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.